This is Steve Fryer. I'm with Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who is an author, lecturer, and inspirational speaker specializing in spirituality, consciousness, and exceptional human experience, along with human potential. Welcome, Rosemary.
Thank you, Steve.
This week you're attending two conferences. Could you describe what they are and why you're there?
The conferences are the Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship International and the Academy of Religion and Psychical Research. They are affiliated with each other. The purpose of them is to provide a forum for the exchange of information about the frontiers of consciousness. This would include such things as exceptional human experience, i.e. opening through psychic experience or mystical experience, kundalini awakenings. We also explore the frontiers in healing, what the latest research is in alternative medicine and healing modalities, for example. We talk about things like, are there going to be earth changes? If so, what does human consciousness have to do about it? How can we quicken ourselves spiritually? And, where are we headed in the future? What's the future of society going to look like?
Perhaps you could give us a brief background on yourself and how you first became interested in the study of metaphysics.
Yes, I became interested in, first, the paranormal, and that occurred for me at a fairly young age. I was about 13. The stimulus for this was the fact that my mother had precognitive dreams. She began telling me about these when I was an adolescent, and the idea that you could dream about something that was going to happen in the future and it would be accurate just boggled my mind. That stimulated me to read books on extrasensory perception. I was a voracious reader when I was very young and an early writer, so all of this stimulated my curiosity. Well, my interest in the paranormal led from one thing to another, became more and more metaphysical and increasingly spiritual over the years until I found that I really was pursuing my spiritual path through metaphysics. And when I became self-employed as a writer, the thing that I wanted to do the most was to continue to explore these areas through my work. So since then, I have written 16 books on such subjects as reincarnation, dreams, mystical and paranormal experience, altered states of consciousness, sacred sites, alchemy,
angels,
healing, power of prayer, literally everything A to Z.
Well, that's great. We really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us. At your conference, I forget which one it is, you told me earlier that you're going to do a keynote address, and that was going to be on shamanic wounding. And you'd indicated that you decided to change that topic. Well, maybe we could find out a little bit more about what you know about shamanic wounding, what that means, and then talk about why you decided to change your topic and what that would be.
Certainly. The paper that I referred to is the keynote address for the Academy of Religion and Psychical Research, the academic affiliate of the Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship, and their conference begins this evening. My original intent for the paper was to explore the area that I call shamanic wounding. That is how we achieve spiritual awakenings and openings in the process of trying to recover from severe trauma and catastrophic illness. There's been a lot in the alternative medical literature and the psychological literature about this, how people realize that they are changing spiritually in the process of healing from illness or attempting to heal from illness. And I wanted to explore the ramifications of that on the evolution of consciousness, if this is a gateway to higher planes of consciousness, our illness healing us to a higher level. Well, the model for shamanism fits this exactly. The shamanic wound is a process by which we acquire spiritual wisdom through illness, and in many tribal societies, in order to even become a shaman, to become a healer, you have to go through this incredible wounding process. You have to become seriously ill, for example, and heal yourself from it in order then to become a healer yourself. And in my research, I found this to be true in many cases, that catastrophic illness was opening people to their own healing powers, and also enabling them not only to heal themselves, but to begin healing others as well.
What kind of illnesses could we be talking about that would fit that model?
Well, cancer, for one. I talked to many cancer patients, and I also talked to people who had had multiple sclerosis and been able to heal themselves from that.
How about AIDS?
AIDS, I haven't found anyone who feels they have cured themselves of AIDS. I have talked to a number of people who have brought about tremendous periods of remission. And I've talked to healers who've been able to have dramatic improvements with their patients through consciousness techniques, altering the consciousness.
Well, you'd be happy to know that the Inner Voice had done a story, I think it was at least 2 years ago now, on a man who healed himself of AIDS. And I conducted the interview myself.
And all traces of it are gone from his...
Well...
or he doesn't have the HIV virus in him anymore?
See, my theory is that the HIV so-called virus does not actually cause AIDS, and I don't think the definition of AIDS is that accurate. From what I remember hearing a number of years ago was that there were something like 80 different possible symptoms that doctors were attributing to AIDS, but there wasn't a very clear-cut definition. And my feeling is they don't really have the right definition. But this man I had met through a healer friend of mine a year prior, and I'd seen him. He was very sick, he was emaciated, and looked like the Walking Dead. A year later, she called me to say, he's a lot better now. So I met with him, and since that was at least 3 years ago, I believe. And my sister ran into him the other day. He lives in Milwaukee. He's walking around. He's very healthy, working 12-hour days, and seems very healthy. But he wasn't willing to share the test results with us. So that's why I stopped pursuing the story. So I can't say conclusively this man had AIDS and healed it, but he definitely was very ill. And from what I understand, his method was to, first of all, fire his doctor, who was a #1 AIDS specialist in Wisconsin, and to quit his what he called support group, which was really supporting the victim consciousness. And from reading and hearing Carolyn Mace's descriptions of first chakra, that's where the victim consciousness resides, and that is perhaps the cause of much of this type of disease, that it really generally attacks people who are in that victim consciousness in the first place.
Yes.
Those are the kinds of people that attract these kinds of diseases. But what was fascinating about him is that he had this all his life, but he then rejected that and started to meditate in a certain way that was comfortable for him. And it seemed to turn it all around. So what can I say? There might be a few people out there that have done it, but I understand your point.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I think there probably are. And, like one of the persons that I met when I was researching the Miracle of Prayer had cured himself of retinitis pigmentosa twice. I mean, first in one eye and then in another eye. And medicine says that's impossible. So, if you can do things like that, why couldn't we overcome AIDS? Well,
I firmly believe we can, and I want to finish my documentary on that and find a few more people to throw in for good measure. But the whole idea of woundology is very interesting to me, and it seems we have a culture that loves to talk about its wounds, and it's, according to Carolyn Mace, it's a way to bond, but it's not a way to heal. If you only stay at that level, you can never go on to become a healer or a healee even.
I agree entirely, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to explore that area. And what you just said about the AIDS and all, this was kind of how I got sidetracked into this other area, because I started thinking, why do we need to go through this in the first place? Why are we dwelling on being wounded in order to be healed, and in order to become spiritually enlightened or to acquire wisdom? It didn't. To me, it seemed like almost a contradiction. And I agree with you that a lot of people get stuck at the wounding stage. They achieve a certain amount of spiritual opening in the process of that, but then they never get beyond it. They kind of plateau. They get stuck in being wounded.
So what was the thrust of your talk on woundology? Was that it, or?
No, I'm really focusing on this. In fact, I do get into the wounding culture a bit in the beginning, and then I talk about why we need to really look beyond that. We need to focus ourselves on a more distant horizon, and that's really this whole idea of immortality, which is a loaded word. You say immortality to people, and quite often they just laugh. They think that it's ludicrous, and very understandably, because we see death around us every day, from the lowest organisms up through ourselves. People die every day, and so the idea of immortality, not dying, seems almost like it's a crazy idea.
Well, you're talking about death and immortality.
Yes, I'm talking about transcending physical death.
Now, you actually mean to retain the physical body. Is that right? Or are you talking about immortality in the spiritual sense, that we're soul and can never die as soul, but may take on different bodies as we choose?
I'm talking about both, and we tend to think of immortality as an after-death kind of thing, that we have this eternal essence, and then after we shed the physical form, there is an immortality of spirit. But I believe that the evolution of our consciousness is leading us directly into physical immortality, but not physical immortality as we might think of it today. In other words, you or I, for example, would not live on forever in these particular bodies, never aging.
Right.
I think that gradually our physical form will become more and more refined, more subtle, more like an energy pattern than something flesh and blood, but that it won't be necessary to go through the trauma of death to have that.
Well, some philosophers state that our body is a physical energy pattern, and that the molecules that make up the body are 99% air, or space in between the what they call the electrons or whatever. So in that sense, we're already that, but perhaps we're just a little more on the dense side.
Right.
In more ways than one.
So to speak.
So to speak.
Well, I do believe that consciousness comes before matter. The world of matter is the product of consciousness. So at some point in the primordial stages of our consciousness, this belief in death occurred. Now, according to the philosophy of Aurobindo, by the way, I think has articulated this subject better than just about any mystic or philosopher I've read.
I've read some Aurobindo.
Yeah.
Which books do you recommend, or a book on this topic? Do you have one?
Actually, some of the best Aurobindo stuff is not by Aurobindo, but it's by some of his disciples who explain it, I think, in more understandable terms than he does. And Sat Prem is one of them.
I've read some of them.
Yeah, there are two books that Sat Prem did, Sri Aurobindo, The Adventures of Consciousness, and The Mind of the Cells, which go into this a great deal.
Well, that's great. I've never met anyone who had actually read anything about Aurobindo. That's great.
Well, he gets pretty weighty for a lot of people.
He's
And
deep.
in fact, when I first read Aurobindo some years ago, I was kind of put off by it. It was just kind of hard to get through.
Well, that's good to hear, because I know you're the supreme intellectual here. I've written 16
Hardly.
books, so I feel better.
Well, it's just, I guess I just had to, get to a point myself where I could grasp some of the ideas that he was getting at. But, his point was that the cells are immortal, and that sometime far, far back, the consciousness acquired the idea that in order to evolve, death would would sort of speed along the process, and that death really is not necessary. But that we have, over time, evolved a very formidable, very dense collective consciousness wedded to this idea of everything dies. In fact, it's the second great shock of coming into a physical body. The first great shock is being born, and the second is learning that we die, which happens to us very early in life. We figure out that things die.
Well, it seems that, that thought form is so pervasive, and if you feel like I do that our collective human thought also affects the rest of nature, and you look at nature and you look at a tree and you say, well, that tree, doesn't live forever either. So that it must be true now that death is inevitable. So maybe that's the thought process. But my feeling is that since we've grown into that over time, that it's our consciousness that's affecting nature now. And if we didn't have this heavy thought form, perhaps the trees and the plants and the flowers, they wouldn't die either.
I agree entirely. I think that because we have self-reflective consciousness, this is a tremendously powerful energy that literally affects everything around us, and I think we can see some evidence for that in quantum physics, with the idea that something isn't real until it's observed. And so our consciousness, our death-oriented consciousness in observing things, sort of puts that vibration into motion. And I believe that the teachings of Jesus were pointed directly at immortality. One of the things that I go into in the paper is I take a look at some of the things that Jesus said. I didn't have space to go into everything in the Gospels. But that one can interpret a lot of his statements to mean immortality. That when he was preaching eternal life, he wasn't talking about life after the grave. He went around raising the dead, and he called death just asleep. And people back then laughed at him and said, oh, no, they're not sleeping, they're dead. And he would raise them from the state that he called sleep. He said he could lay down his life and take it up again. Well, of course, you could say, well, this is a contradiction here because he died. He died on the cross. And so if he was out to talk about eternal life without death, then why did he go through the crucifixion? I believe that that was necessary. I consider Jesus a supremely enlightened soul, and that he grasped these things. He was very sophisticated alchemically, so to speak. And the crucifixion, I think, was necessary to demonstrate at a very gross level of consciousness that the crucifixion and the resurrection, that death, like time, is not absolute. It's it has no absolute meaning. But this idea just could not be comprehended by the mass consciousness. We could only interpret it in terms of an afterlife. But when you look at the Gospels and also the writings of St. Paul, you see over and over again references to the raising of the spiritual body, which I believe is this evolutionary process.
So do you see any way that we can break this spell? I call it a spell because
it is.
It's sort of like a mass hypnosis that since we believe in death and we focus on it, we put so much emotional energy on it, therefore it's real. But I know there are some people, I've heard of Babaji and a few others, who preach the text of immorality. Correct me. Immortality.
Well, that's it, maybe.
No. But anyway, you probably studied more about what these advanced beings have to say. And I should add in here that Aurobindo, a lot of people have lost faith in him because he did die too, even though he preached immortality.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Exactly. In fact, a lot of people who preached heavily on immortality, they're all dead.
Well, maybe we could say they're pioneers, to be charitable, I guess, and that someone's got to start somewhere to break this spell.
Well, in fact, Aurobindo said that he felt that it would take a long time and a lot of effort by some very enlightened people to even make inroads into this mass hypnosis, as you call it. And we are in this mass hypnosis, buying into the idea of death. He felt it's not going to be a one-person kind of thing. He and his spiritual partner, the mother, decided at one point in their lives not to seek what they called the deathless life for themselves, like the ascended masters, but that they felt that they needed to dedicate everything they could in their lives to changing this mass consciousness, and probably had an effect. Now, Aurobindo did make a conscious exit from the body. You know, he chose his time of death.
His
body did not decompose for 9 days, and a lot of his disciples thought that he was going to resurrect himself, and the mother was in communication with him during this time, and she asked him to come back, and he said, no, I'm not going to come back. I'm not going to come back until I have that spiritual body, which he called a supramental body. And at 9 days, the body began to decompose, and they buried him.
Well, you know,
the mother said that she was very hindered by the consciousness around her as she got older. She died at 95. And she said that other people who continually reinforced to her the idea that she was getting old and getting feeble and was about to die hindered her own efforts to work at the level of cellular consciousness. Both she and Aurobindo said you have to get to the level of the cells where all of the primordial beliefs, fears, and desires of the human consciousness reside. It's at the cellular level.
Well, they say Yogananda didn't decompose for about a month after he died, but he didn't live to be that old, did he? He wasn't in his 90s, that's for sure.
Right. Let's see. Aurobindo he died in 1950. He was in his 70s, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You know, I'm in religious science, and we've had quite a number of ministers who have lived to be 95, 100, you know, because they just did not acknowledge death. And I'm sure that they could have lasted longer if they hadn't had an accident or something.
Well, Charles Fillmore, you know, the co-founder
sure.
of Unity, he expected to live a very long time. He believed very firmly that we have misinterpreted the teachings of Jesus, and that Jesus was talking about immortality. And he wrote quite a bit about this. The Unity Church tends to downplay this a lot because it's such a loaded subject. You know, they have enough trouble as it is, as just dealing with you know, other denominations who want to make them out to be a cult because of their metaphysical orientation. But I've read Fillmore's works on that, and it's right in line with Aurobindo. And I don't know if Fillmore ever let's see, no, he would have died even before Aurobindo got much into that. He died in the 40s, and so I'm not sure if he ever was able to read anything. But so I thought that that's really what the crux of this is. The crux of this whole shamanic wounding thing has the potential to lead us in this direction, to lead our consciousness up beyond being wounded, to figuring out that we could apply ourselves to overcoming death, which is the greatest fear humanity has. And fear is what is holding us back to this gross material plane. Aurobindo said that eventually we would become patterns of energy, that there would be these vibratory patterns that would begin to transform the body. And he also said that he didn't think it was going to happen all at once, that it was going to be a very difficult process, and that probably would affect bits and pieces of humanity, depending upon a lot on individual consciousness as well. But until there could be some sort of shift at a mass level, which would be cellular consciousness, he didn't think, he thought we would be stymied in our spiritual evolution.
Well, let me ask you, who do you look to today? Who is out there leading the way that you could point to besides yourself?
I really don't see this subject being addressed.
What about Deepak? Didn't he write a book on immortality?
Oh, well, yes. In Ageless Body, Timeless Mind, he touches upon this, but my feeling is he kind of skirted the issue, and I think because it's a loaded word and a loaded subject, that makes you a very easy target to be called a lunatic on.
Well, we have who's the guy that started the conscious breathing, Leonard Orr. Have you ever received any of his newsletters?
No.
he actually wrote a book on immortality and really pumped Babaji as his, deathless guru, saying that Babaji is something like, I forget, 300 or 800 years old or whatever.
Yeah, it's at least 600. I mentioned Babaji in the paper, too.
Well, I can see why you're concerned, because a lot of people feel Leonard Orr is a little off the edge, and from the way he writes, he just seems a little whacked. But at least he's putting it out there, and he's teaching a lot of people how to breathe properly.
I have a couple of quotes from Chopra in my paper.
Mm-hmm.
About the most that he would say about immortality is the strongest thing I could find in that book is this quote: "Finding this world within ourselves and experiencing it even for a moment could have a profound effect on the process of sickness and aging, if not death itself." And what he's talking about is finding this, experiencing this timelessness, being able to transcend time. And that's another thing that we have to change as well, is our slavery to time, which quantum physics shows us, linear time just isn't, except as we make it.
If you were going to put together a program right now, what would you recommend people do?
Well, there are a number of things, and Chopra did outline, I thought, some very good things to do to at least change our perspective of time, shifting our states of consciousness away from being so deadline-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I found is that, and I think this is a byproduct of being a writer, I almost found this accidentally, is that when I'm creating, when I'm in research and in writing, I am fully in the moment of what I am doing.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else just falls away. And I truly believe that in that moment, time expands. Time expands for me. People ask me, how can you turn out so much? And I think one of the reasons is that, there may be many reasons. I don't have to do a lot of rewriting, and I seem to be able to organize material pretty quickly. But I am so in the moment that, for me, I have all the time in the world to do whatever it is I'm doing. And I think that we can expand and contract time on our own. I really do believe that. Michael Murphy's book, which came out in the 70s, called The Psychic Side of Sports, had numerous stories attesting to that in athletics. The athletes who are in the zone.
The flow.
They're in the heat of a game, and they're making that shot or that pass, and suddenly they feel time expand, so that things are almost in slow motion, and yet it's over with very quickly.
That whole idea has been expanded with this gentleman at the University of Chicago. I can't pronounce his name. It starts with a C, and his book is called The Flow. And that's exactly what he talks about.
Oh, right. I know which book you mean. Yeah, it's a complicated name.
Yeah, one of my partners is reading it. But, Michael Murphy's has gone on to, write the book Golf in the Garden. So he relates that a lot to his favorite sport, golf.
So, being in the moment, in other words, fully focusing ourselves on what we are doing at the time, and also telling ourselves, and this is one thing that I do, especially if I start to feel stressed and rushed on something, like a lot of pressures on me to do things by certain deadlines, because I live in a deadline-oriented world, we all do.
Right.
And I tell myself I have all the time I need to get done what I must get done.
What a great idea. Recently at our office, I work in video production, the owner came in and he was all uptight that we're spending all this money and didn't have any jobs. So he said, you have a deadline of 2 months to haul in some business, and took us off these wonderful documentaries we're working on that would really change consciousness. And, we all freaked out for about a day, and I thought, well, I'm just going to call the religious science hotline. We're going to pray about it, and we're going to turn it over. So we went, I know when I do that, because I'm a healing practitioner too, that we move into this timeless place, and that's when things get done, right then and there. As you know, and as you're describing right now, I think we've all experienced that wonderful flow. To me, that's the state of prayer. That's really what prayer is all about. But you're directing it a little bit in a certain direction, but you're also open to what the universe might want to add to that, and that's usually a quantum leap from what you were thinking in the first place. And if you're
Right.
receptive,
It is a quantum leap in consciousness, and prayer and meditation are key to that because we get into this timelessness when we pray and meditate. And I think the more we do that, the more we shift our consciousness away from linear time, the better able we are to change our death-oriented consciousness. This also requires working against the very formidable and powerful machinery of the media.
Mm-hmm.
Media and the fashion industry, the consumer-oriented industry, which harps at us all the time how to keep ourselves young, slow down aging. We live in a youth-oriented culture, and so the media reminds us all the time that we're getting older, that time is getting short. And I limit my exposure to the media. I really do. I rarely watch TV. I don't read a newspaper, frankly, and it's not that I'm not informed about the world, because I keep up with events, but I don't feel that it is productive to be assaulted by every disaster the moment it happens. You can't do anything about it anyway from where you are. It's the media that concerns me, the influence of the media. I'm not an anti-government person or anything like that. I think that Andrew Weil had some good recommendations in his book, Spontaneous Healing, when he said, take a vacation from the media. Don't read the paper every day. Don't listen to the radio. Don't watch TV for a while. And see how that changes your consciousness. I believe that we can keep our place as citizens of the world and informed about things we need to be informed on. We don't want to live in ignorance, certainly, especially when we're in an increasingly global village. But we don't need to be assaulted as often as we allow ourselves to be assaulted by especially reports of violence, because that's 99% of the media, reports of violence everywhere. And it's, I think this adds an incredible amount of stress to the consciousness, and it keeps reinforcing death.
Right.
Well, now, another thing that I am trying to reintroduce people to is a mantra that the mother received through divine inspiration while she was working on this idea of cellular consciousness after Aurobindo's death. I believe very strongly in the power of mantra to change consciousness.
Okay.
And it's in the paper. I'll give it to you as well, because I decided that I'm going to start mentioning this mantra in as many of my workshops as possible. And it's called Om Namo, Namo, Bhagavata, Bhagavath. And what that means, kind of loosely translated, is I honor the divine enjoyer of pure bliss and immortal joy within. She said that this mantra speaks directly to the cellular consciousness, encouraging liberation from the prison of death consciousness. Om Namo Bhagavata. And, so I thought, well, I'm going to work with that.
Okay.
And just, see what happens, see how people respond to that. And this may be something that you might have to repeat for a lifetime, But I think that the more that this kind of vibration permeates our consciousness, the more we alter the mass consciousness. So
well, maybe
we have to start someplace.
Maybe we could promote that phrase at the World Peace Healing Meditation on December 31st each year.
I think that's a great idea.
It could be an easy addition and give people something to focus on, because I've been to a number of these gatherings and they don't seem to know what to think about, and this would make it so much simpler.
Well, that's what I like about the mantra, and I that's published in Satprem's book, The Mind of the Cells. And I thought, well, that is something for people to focus on, to have a handle. It's fairly easy to remember, and people, if you get people in the habit of just saying it periodically even, I think it would have a beneficial effect.
Well, I think it's a point well taken, and we will definitely want to hear more about your adventures into the immortality consciousness. And you're still writing the article?
Yes, I still have my column in Fate.
I've seen a couple of issues of that. I don't get it regularly, but it looks very good. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule today.
Well, I really appreciate it, Steve. I'm so glad we reconnected.
All right, well, I'll let you get back to your conference.
Well,
Things
thank
didn't
you
work
so
out
much,
for me.
Steve. I really appreciate it.
Okay, well, hopefully we'll be in touch
Okay.
more often after this.